So now I would like to introduce Morton Satin, the Vice President for Science and Research from the SALT Institute. Thank you, Morton.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Morton Satin. I'm with the SALT Institute. And I'm concerned that the latest iteration of the Dietary Guidelines, the 2010 Dietary Guidelines, which recommend a level of 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day for more than half the population and 2,300 for the other half of the population, may very well have negative consequences upon our health. You heard that correctly, really quite negative consequences on our health. As a food scientist, I base this assertion not upon my opinion or any particular ideology or because I work for the SALT Institute. I base my concerns on the peer-reviewed evidence that the SALT Institute did not support or write, but is out there in the scientific literature and that has been ignored by the Dietary Guidelines. For instance, a recent report came out of Harvard Medical School. Let me see if I can get that one out. Yeah. Of Harvard Medical School, linking reduced salt intakes to an increase in insulin resistance, the condition that's a precursor to type 2 diabetes. The title of the paper doesn't really mince words. Low-salt diets increase insulin resistance in healthy subjects. Healthy people were placed on a low-salt diet and developed insulin resistance within 7 days of going on that low-salt diet. The other half of the group, which was placed on a regular salt diet, also healthy, did not develop any negative consequences. 7 days is just about an immediate response to going on a low-salt diet. Now, wouldn't you think that such dramatic clinical evidence coming from such an authoritative source would be seriously considered in making recommendations to the American public? And it wasn't. According to the latest evidence, the recommended reduction in salt intake may very well promote an epidemic of diabetes to accompany the epidemic that we now have of obesity. And speaking of the obesity epidemic, the reduced salt guidelines will worsen, not improve, the ongoing obesity crisis. Now, this may sound counterintuitive to a number of people, but please let me explain. People will consume more calories just to satisfy their innate salt appetite. We have decades of animal feeding experience as a foundation for this statement. And a great deal of salt, as a matter of fact, as much salt goes into the animal feeding world as goes into consumer salt, showing, well, what we do there is, in fact, we add salt to certain feeds to make sure that animals don't consume too much of them. And if we want them to eat more feed, what we do is remove the salt. So aside from salt, we have many, many other examples that we could look at. When light beer was produced, people drank more, of course. When we cut the sugar out of soft drinks, people swilled a great deal more of the low-cal beverages. When we cut the fat out of foods, people gorged themselves on low-fat, no-fat foods to the extent of ushering in the current obesity epidemic. Now, one of the things that I really try to do is tell people what they really already know from their own experiences. And based on our experiences, what do you think a consumer will do when faced with a huge bag of low-salt potato chips? They'll eat more than they did in the past. So cutting back on salt will in fact exacerbate the obesity crisis, and most nutritionists, most professional nutritionists agree that this will most likely happen. The main concern about sodium is based on the supposed connection between salt consumption and hypertension, an issue that's been hotly debated for the last 30, 40 years. But what are the actual claimed benefits to salt reduction? In fact, there is a total benefit projected of somewhere between 2 and 6 millimeters systolic pressure, millimeters mercury, in the systolic part of your blood pressure. That's claimed for a 2/3 drop in the amount of salt that you take. Now, 2 to 6 millimeters, if you have hypertension and you're up at 160 or something like that, and you drop 2 to 6 millimeters, you're not going to really be able to stop taking your hypertension medicine, obviously. And any physician who proposes that people cut salt in lieu of taking their blood pressure medicine should be taken to account for malpractice. When you have heard the figures that reducing salt may save 150,000 lives a year, you've always seen these figures bantered around. What do these figures mean? First of all, none of them were ever based on clinical studies. What they do is they take this 2 to 6 millimeters of mercury on an individual basis and say, well, maybe as individuals we won't be really affected, but if you take that 2 to 6 millimeters and you multiply it across a population of 300 million people, by statistical manipulation, that can actually come out to saving 150,000 lives. In other words, it's all statistical manipulation, no evidence whatsoever, other than the fact that if you drop your salt by 2/3, people who are salt sensitive, and only people who are salt sensitive, will drop their blood pressure anywhere from 2 to 6 millimeters. But what you haven't been told is that although 30% of the population will drop their blood pressure 2 to 6 millimeters, 20% of the population, by reducing salt by 2/3, will increase their blood pressure by 2 to 6 millimeters, because our response to salt and salt reduction is heterogeneous. Now, and the rest of the 50% of the population won't show any effect at all. So in fact, have the dietary guidelines become an instrument of discriminatory policy, where one portion of the population will apparently benefit to some extent, even if it's very small, while another portion of the population is made to suffer? I mean, this is a conundrum that has never been discussed in the dietary guidelines, and the evidence is there. By the way, I want to say something, that this paper is up on the Salt Institute website, and I think it will probably be on the Weston Price website. Everything that we do, because it's such a controversial issue, and because we are the Salt Institute and accused of stealing candy from babies and all the worst things imaginable, we have a habit of any statement that is made is fully backed up by the peer-reviewed evidence in the clinical journals. So our paper has hyperlinks to every reference that I'm referring to in this paper. So you yourself can go back and read the paper. And if you ever see a spot where you think we've misinterpreted, please let us know. Even the very connection between salt intakes and the rising rates of hypertension have recently been disputed in another study out of Harvard by the country's most eminent nutritionist, Walter Willett. The study demonstrates that while hypertension and obesity have increased among Americans over the last 40 years, sodium or salt consumption has remained virtually flat, unchanged. These findings contradict the myth that assumes increasing salt intake as the main driver for hypertension. If over the last 4 decades hypertension has increased, but salt has remained flat, then the two are not related. Since the primary reason for placing limits on salt is the fear that it was related to the rising rates of hypertension, the exclusion of this most recent peer-reviewed paper makes it clear, the exclusion from the dietary guidelines, makes it clear that the dietary guidelines are no longer a product of science, they are a product of ideology.